Hello everyone, Mr. Lipchick here, and welcome to our fourth and final part of our foreign policy discussion, which is entitled Foreign Policy in Action. Mutual Defense Alliance. A mutual defense alliance is when nations and allies agree to support one another in case of attack. And this is usually between nations that have a lot of common interests. The U.S. has alliances with many nations and has a number of alliances and pacts with them. And there is such a thing as a regional security pact, and these are treaties to protect large geographic areas such as Europe or Latin America. One of the largest organizations that supports this type of mutual defense is NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And this is an alliance between the United States and the Northern European nations to aid one another in case of attack by the Soviet Union. That's why it was formed. Although there is no longer a Soviet Union, the organization still exists. There were U.S. troops stationed in West Germany for many years, large numbers. However, that number is much smaller. Okay, the U.S., British, and other NATO troops trained together in a common defense against the Soviet threat, or possible Soviet invasion that we were worried about. The Soviets had an alliance with the communist Eastern European nations, which was known as the Warsaw Pact. And the Eastern European nations were pretty much forced into it because the communists or the Russians occupied those countries. NATO was established after World War II to give Western Europe time to recover and establish democratic governments. There was a fear that communism would take over because people were so impoverished by the devastation of the war. The end of the Cold War ended NATO's original purpose, so NATO began to redefine its purpose. NATO expanded its mission to world peacekeeping. It expanded its membership to some former Warsaw Pact nations. It conducted peacekeeping missions in the former Yugoslavia. And the U.S. has drawn down its European forces since the end of the Cold War, although we still do have a presence in Germany, about a brigade-size element. Latin America. In 1947, the U.S. signed a common defense treaty with the nations of Latin America known as the Rio Pact. To the right you see the city of Rio de Janeiro. It's called the Rio Pact because it was signed there. Most Latin American nations remained under the pact. Cuba withdrew after its communist revolution in 1960, however. Only one Latin American nation, Brazil, aided the United States during World War II. They were all ostensibly our allies, however, Brazil was the only country that committed troops, and they committed very few. They sent 1 battalion of troops to the European theater during the war. In 1948, the U.S. signed the treaty establishing the Organization of American States, or OAS. This treaty was aimed at promoting economic growth within the Western Hemisphere. And it was not a defense treaty, it was an economic treaty. Pacific. The U.S. has a regional security pact with Australia and New Zealand, known as the ANZUS Pact, signed in 1951. These nations would come to each other's aid in case of attack. In 1984, New Zealand adopted a policy of not allowing nuclear-powered ships or nuclear weapons in its ports. This caused the U.S. to announce in 1986 that it could no longer guarantee New Zealand's safety under the treaty. President Obama has recently stationed over 2,000 Marines in northern Australia. And this has been done to counter China's growing military power in the region. So we've established an air base there as a buffer zone for Australia. And Marines will operate an air base there for the foreseeable future. Bilateral treaties. A multilateral treaty is an international agreement signed by several nations. The examples were just discussed: NATO, Rio, and ANZAC. They're all multilateral treaties. But there are also bilateral treaties. A bilateral treaty is an agreement involving two nations. The U.S. has signed many bilateral treaties with many nations such as Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. To the right, you see President Reagan and Soviet leader Gorbachev signing a treaty. The objective of many of our treaties is collective security. Collective security is defined as a system by which the participating nations agree to take joint actions against a nation that attacks any one of them. Foreign aid is a tool that is used frequently in the treaty, the international organizations in economic growth, kind of a carrot and stick approach. So it is a useful tool in foreign policy when you award economic or military aid to other nations. And the U.S. provides billions of dollars in economic and military aid to foreign nations every year, and this helps us accomplish many of our aims without actually using the threat of force or troops or anything like that. The Agency for International Development, or AID, is a State Department agency that directs economic aid programs. And loans, technical assistance, and other resources are provided. Military aid is given to governments friendly to the United States. This sometimes is very controversial, as in the case with many repressive Latin American governments that have received U.S. aid and have murdered missionaries and done things like that. By providing economic aid, we avoid revolutions and violence in countries that receive it. Many cannot provide basic necessities for their own people. Economic sanctions. To the right is a flag of Iran. We have had many economic sanctions against them since the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Sanctions refers to withholding loans, arms, or economic aid to force a foreign government to cease certain activities. Trade restrictions can be implemented in response to the actions of foreign nations. In the 1980s, President Reagan implemented trade restrictions against the Soviet Union in response to their suppression of a Polish trade union. Using military force is an instrument of diplomacy in some cases. Periodically, military force must be used in order to protect American lives or establish peace in other regions of the world. To the right, you see soldiers in Grenada in 1983 with captured communist rebels in that country. Since World War II, the U.S. has used military force in the following countries: Korea, Vietnam, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Grenada, Panama, Iraq, Afghanistan, and this is not an exhaustive list. There are many others. That concludes our discussion of foreign policy in action. Thank you for viewing, and I look forward to seeing you in the live lesson soon. Have a great day.